So good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome back to our conference. I am your moderator for this afternoon, and I want to just introduce myself to you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is April Adams, and I am a student of Dr. Montero. He didn't want me to say that. The reason that I'm here is because on February 26th, 2012, George Zimmerman murdered Trayvon Martin. And on that day, that murder really touched me deeply because Trayvon Martin was 17 years old. And I have a son, 17 years old. Well, he was 17 at the time, he's 20 now. And I said to myself, I said that, you know, Joshua, that's his name, he walks through the neighborhood. We live in a white suburb, and he walks through the neighborhood, and, you know, he goes to the corner store, and he also likes Skittles. And I said to myself, if this could happen to him, this could happen to my son. And on that day, I woke up. Before that time, though, all of my energy went to raising my 3 children. As a single mother, all I had time for and all I had energy for was to care for my children and make sure, you know, that they were provided for. But after that day, I decided to get active. I was awakened to the reality that I could only save Joshua, John, that's my oldest son, and my daughter Portia, by that matter, by joining the movement for freedom of my people. This brought me into an engagement with historical events such as this, Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro. I also joined a group called ATTACK, stands for Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, a group that attorney Michael Court facilitates. It was there that I heard and met Dr. Montero. And from that time, I have been learning and growing, and I continue to grow. In the struggle, I've met some wonderful and fascinating people, such as yourself. And I absolutely enjoy spaces like this. I feel at home with people like you. I feel a sense of peace when I'm around people like you. I have hope when I'm here with people like you guys. So I'm absolutely glad to be here. And it's in that spirit that I moderate today. So today, this panel will talk about internationalism and resistance to imperialism. And so I want to introduce to you our panel today. We have, now please, I'm going to ask you to forgive me in advance because I might mess up the last name anyway. But I'll do my best. We have 3 panelists. Ania Loomba, did I say that right? Ania Loomba. She's a professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania and a veteran of Indian communist movement. And then we have Suzanne Adely. I got it right. She is a Jordanian labor and human rights lawyer who is part of the Palestinian rights movement. And then we have Sharon Sobukwe. She's a professor at Eastern State University who has experience with Cuba's role in Pan-African liberation movements. Our 4th speaker is not able to be with us, but we want to welcome you guys, and I'll turn it over. Now, I know each of you will speak. I don't know who goes first, but each of you will speak. Okay. So you.
I've just come from quite an inspiring march downtown, the Women's March, where I know a lot of people didn't agree, but it was actually good to be there. It was also about solidarity because the people I went to college with were texting me one had gone to a march in Lisbon, one had gone to a march in Dublin, one had gone to a march in London. And I was saying to my mother, who lives in India and who's 92, and a little more about her later, there should have been a march in Delhi as well about this, for reasons that will become clear as soon as I talk. So in 1959, Fidel sent Che to India to forge ties with the fairly young decolonized nation. The next year, the Indian government, soon after Che's visit, India opened its mission in Cuba. And that history is only one small little bit of a very, very long story, which was about all the connections forged in the crucible of anti-imperialism. And that's the India that I grew up in, and those ties are entirely imperilled today. On January 14 this year, the ruling right-wing Hindu Nationalist Party demanded that all of Che's images should be taken down from the state of Kerala, which is in the coast of India, which happens to be India's first communist ruled state and one of the longest left-wing communist elected governments in the world. But the point is not who is in power there. The point is that Che is everywhere, not only in that state, but everywhere else in India, on college billboards, in coffee shops, wall paintings, and even on footwear, okay, which I'm not sure is a great thing, but anyway, his image is on footwear as well. Of course, this is not so different from other parts of the world, but perhaps what is different here is that, at least in this part of the world, more than a century actually, of ties have been forged in common battle. And the right-wing government today in India is attempting to wipe out those connections that have actually shaped the history of decolonization and the internationalism that has in turn fueled the revolutionary movement. So I was born in independent India. I wasn't part of colonial India, but as the child of communist parents, I was made acutely aware of how India's independence did not guarantee freedom to all our people. My parents steered me between two perspectives. One, the need to safeguard the solidarities that had been built during the anti-colonial movements. And newly independent India aligned itself, it was very politically correct, with other anti-colonial movements. The South Africa anti-apartheid movement stood against the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. When I went to college, I had a lot of Algerian friends, and they told me that when Algeria became free, and they first had representatives in the United Nations, and they had people who had no experience of international politics, the joke went that you saw how India voted and you voted the same way, because you could be reasonably sure that it would be okay. That legacy of anti-imperialism was actually, it's not that Indians knew what it was all about, but they had, fought and they were learning still from Palestinians and Cubans and South Africans and with Vietnam. And I want to talk for a few minutes about my life and how it was shaped as a young woman every day by these things. So near the apartment where I grew up, in sort of a busy part of New Delhi, was a small apartment which had been rented out by the African National Congress. And its representative, Mrs. Basiman, was there without very much money, trying to raise 3 or 4 children in Delhi. And she would come over often to my apartment, our apartment, talk to my parents and so on. And talk also about the racism that she and her children occasionally were subject to from other Indians, living there. So you can have political ties, you can have ideological ties, but where do you learn to have those other kinds of ties, But she spent a whole lifetime in India, and as a result, I think her children and her children's friendships, they taught us all about not just something that comes out of books, but it was a lived experience of living with, kind of African struggles. Then the next thing I remember is that as a young girl, I went to hear Madame Nguyen B. Thin, who was then a leader of the Communist Party in Vietnam, when she visited India in 1970. And by the time when she came, the right-wing hoodlums were trying to disrupt these meetings. They was, not letting that happen. And I was kind of scared, kind of exhilarated, and I went and heard her speak. And she gave me something which I bring here. She gave me a ring, which was made by the Vietnamese anti-imperialist forces from aircraft, which they shot down. And you can see the plane number here. I'm going to pass it around. It was always too big for me, but I always wore it around my neck. And I brought it here because it still gives me goosebumps to see a kind of a physical something, a remnant of that moment. And when I went to Vietnam 2 years ago, and I went to the museum there, in Ho Chi Minh City, and there she is. And you realize how much of her life, what it took to go to India, to stand there. Governmental support is all very well, but there was a lot of pressure against, people like that. But I heard a poem from Ho Chi Minh earlier, but for all of us, Ho Chi Minh was organic. So, even when we were demonstrating against price rise in India, which had nothing to do with the international situation, well, it did, but not exactly. Here were our slogans. Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, we shall fight, we shall win. Okay. Or, okay, the other one, Tera naam, mera naam, Vietnam, Vietnam, which is your name, my name, Vietnam, Vietnam. It's a poem, and, so these are what I grew up on, it was like, and, we learnt a lot through this. But then, what on the other hand did anti-imperialism mean? I think not just but alliances between states. In Nehruvian India, maybe that's what the Indian state was okay with. It no longer is. But it was also ties between people. And so, thus it was that I first heard of Angela Davis during the International Free Angela Davis campaign organized during the infamous 16-month incarceration in 1970-71. And even as Angela Davis was being victimized for being an anti-racist fighter, for being a Marxist, and for being a feminist, she became a really important figure in forging a certain kind of international solidarity. That's when I read George Jackson's Prison Soledad Brother. It was an education for all of us, because there was Angela, and there were people. Again, it's a personal collection. You'll forgive me, this is not just about me and my family, but it's just about bringing home those things in a graphic way. And my father, who was a labor organizer, wrote a pamphlet, because she wasn't, people in India didn't actually have that much even knowledge about African American history and struggle. And he wrote this pamphlet on Angela Davis. And the last 2 pages of this was an appeal to Indian workers from the trade unions to unite to free Angela, prisoner of US racists and imperialists. And it ends with saying, what is at stake is Angela's life. What is at stake is the fight of black people against racism. What is at stake is the US people's fight against imperialism. And then it ends with, Angela will not hang. End racial oppression, down with US imperialism. I'm just going to pass, I brought 4 copies of this. And when I read my father's words, he died when I was 17. So I didn't grow up with his legacy, a live legacy. But then I read this and I realized that, there was a lot of education going on among Indian working class from this, kind of point of view. A crucial aspect of these international solidarities was the question of gender. How were women going to unite under imperialism? And how were these unities going to be in conversation and also in quarrel with their male comrades, And shortly after my father died, my mother went to Cuba. And here I'm circulating a picture of her with Fidel. And she says, there are many copies, just pass it around please. And the other side is her with Arafat, much later. But she said he came and he listened to the whole conference, and it was full of women actually saying how they hadn't done all the things that they should have done during the Cuban Revolution for women. But she says, we were really moved. And next to her is someone I can't identify, but it's a Palestinian comrade. And I've been trying to put it together with Hanan Ashafi and see if that may be her. But I tried to match it, and it may have been a young Hanan Ashafi, I don't know. So, in those years and up until the 1990s, my Indian passport was stamped, not valid for travel to South Africa and to Israel. But I think, this kind of, and I felt very proud of that. I said, I don't want to go to South Africa or to Israel. But it didn't come in the way of conversations with the anti-imperialist and anti-apartheid fighters in those places. So there was somebody who wrote a book called Shakespeare Against Apartheid. And I had written a book on Shakespeare and the way it was being misused in Indian education. And the two of us corresponded in a very roundabout way because there was no mail between South Africa and India as well. And just before apartheid fell and we could travel, we met together in Johannesburg in this conference called Shakespeare, Johannesburg, Post-Coloniality, 1994. So I'm saying that these things have gone up and down, these solidarities, but without them, I don't think I could have intellectually even thought about some of the questions that have been so important for me. That India that I grew up in has changed. Over the last 2 decades, the Indian state has turned away from the pro-freedom and self-determination stance that it adopted after decolonization. Now it eagerly buys arms from Israel. According to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, India is now the #1 export target of Israel's defense industries. Indeed, Israel has become the world's largest exporter of arms because of India's patronage. India has not only acquired drones and radars from Israel, but it's sent up Joint Anti-Terror Commission with it. India is also eager to learn surveillance and policing methods from Israel as it quells discontent and human rights within its own borders, especially Kashmir, in which the situation has eerie echoes with that obtaining in Palestine. And under a Hindu majoritarian government today, India is anxious to position itself as a participant in the global war on terror. And at this particular moment, it's all the moment, so I keep thinking there's something wrong with me. I travel between Modi's India and Trump's America. I need my head examined. But these are the two places that I know and that I work in. And these are the two places that I must fight in to change the situation. I'm not going to about to immigrate to Canada or Costa Rica, lovely as that sounds. So let me end with a snippet from a book that I'm writing. Do I have 2 minutes? Yeah, I'm writing a book about some of the histories of left-wing women that are lost. It's the forgotten worlds, the lost worlds of communism, if you like. I'm going to tell you a short one. This woman that I had known really all my life, she was a trade unionist, a feminist, a lawyer who really fought in courts and outside it. And I said, okay, I'm going to interview her and find out what was her life like. And I got such a shock. The first thing she told me is that until she was 30, she didn't think of herself as Indian. She thought she was African. She was born and brought up in Kenya because the railroad in Kenya was built by Indian workers, and her father had gone there. But also, all the trade unions in Kenya, black, and the trade unions were actually multiracial. They had been built by, as it turned out, an Indian man, Makhan Singh, and by, the left unity there was also by two other men, Achuru Kapila and Pio da Gama. I'd never heard of these names. So this is the state of, you think the fights between Indians and Africans in Kenya now would, it's a forgotten history of left internationalism and radical internationalism. So she starts talking, and she says that her parents sent her to Britain to study law, and then she came home one holiday, and what was going on but the Mau Mau rebellion, right? The infamous Mau Mau rebellion, which was quelled and people were put into concentration camps, and here she was, a young lawyer, and because she was Indian, she was less suspect than if she had been black. So she attached herself, but all the defense team was either Indian or even white British. Ben Bradley came and fought for the Mau Mau, and she attached herself and she spoke all the local languages, so she translated for them. And she said, I got obsessed. I went back to London and I said, there's no rule of law in Kenya. She said, I was obsessed with the Mau Mau. So then she became attached to Pio da Gama when he was fighting for with the land petition. And she did all the work for, the Mau Mau activists. And then she fell in love with a South African man called H.T. Naidu. And Naidu said to her, you're a Marxist, I'm a Marxist, we are made together and we will fight together and we will win and we will conquer. And then one day she heard one of Naidu's friends saying, he says he can't marry you because you are not South African. And his whole political future depends on marrying another South African. And I'm not sure what the rules were, even though she was of Indian descent. There were some peculiar, crazy things going on in South Africa about marriage laws. So she said, my heart was broken. And she went to Warsaw to an international socialist conference. And she said, I needed a stranger to tell my whole story to. So I found a Polish law professor. And she told him all the story. And he said, no, go to India. That you belong in India. And then she met the Communist Party of India's head who said, you have to come to India. You're not African, you're Indian. And they persuaded her that she was actually Indian, that her ethnicity trumped her heart and her politics and her upbringing. So she went to India, she married a trade unionist, she lived all her life there. But when I met her, she just died after that. She said, I'm sorry, my heart is still in Kenya. So her daughters had Kenyan citizenship. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm very, very happy to be here today, and thank you so much for the invitation. This is actually only the third time I've ever been in the city of Philadelphia. I came from New York. I drove in this morning. And I think I actually left my notes on my kitchen table, but that's cool. I don't really, I was able to sort of jot down some notes earlier this afternoon as I heard the first panel, and more gears in my head started to get rolling, and I thought more about how I can contribute to this discussion on the legacy of Castro and the Cuban Revolution and internationalism and resistance to imperialism globally. And I will start by just maybe, since this is my first time getting to know all of you, I'll talk a little bit about myself and what I do. I was born in Southwest Yonkers, right outside of the Bronx, to a working class immigrant family that came from a factory worker and a shop steward in his factory. My parents were also staunch Arab nationalists, and I grew up simultaneously learning about the suffering of US imperialism in the Arab world, in Southwest Asia and North Africa, and the globe, really, and simultaneously sort of getting a lesson on racial and economic injustice from the streets of South Yonkers, which was notorious for the battle to desegregate its schools and its housing in the 1980s, and which had a movement that was also involved in the anti-police brutality movement that emerged in the 90s. And it's through that that I began to sort of get radicalized, but not in a way at all at that age that was theoretical. It was just sort of instinctive, sort of by noticing the social issues that were around you. But then at some point in my life, I think when I began college and the Gulf War began, I was lucky enough to get to know those in my community who had been part of the struggle to liberate Palestine for a very long time. And they began to sort of mentor youth like me, along with their comrades in the Puerto Rican and Black struggle, who would also play a role in helping to mentor Arab and Palestinian youth in New York and in other cities, to sort of give us the kind of theoretical and organizing tools that we would need to organize in this country in a way where we can demand that people see empire, and we can demand that people see the way that neoliberalism and capitalism is creating economic violence throughout the world, and in a way that we can also organize and advocate for racial justice and economic justice in the neighborhoods and cities that we lived in the United States. And it was about that time, I think I remember Castro came to the Bronx. I think it was like 94 or 95. I got a call from one of my political mentors, Palestinian leftist who's no longer active. And he said, get yourself to Jimmy's right now because Castro is there having lunch, or having dinner. And Jimmy's was this restaurant right on the border of the Bronx called Jimmy's Bronx Cafe, which is no longer there. And I tried my best to get there, but having very strict Arab immigrant parents and having to take the bus, I missed them, right? And it's okay. And I recall during that time, I remember dreams that I have very, very vividly sometimes, especially when they're political. And I recall during that time, in the mid-90s, I had a dream in which Castro made an appearance. And he was sitting in the back of a livery cab. I don't know if livery cabs is these sort of like black town cars that we use in New York. And he was showing up on our street, and he was in a state of great weakness at that point in my dream. And we were, myself and whoever else was around me in my dream, was doing our best to help him kind of compose himself so that he could speak to us. And this was like in 1995, and the Gulf War had ended a few years before the first Gulf War, and the Oslo Accords also were signed and began to sort of be implemented. And the Oslo Accords were part of a peace process. I meant peace process, but I really meant a peace process that began the legalization of the savage occupation and colonization of Palestine and opened up the markets of Southwest Asia and North Africa to more extreme and more holistic capitalist violence that came in the shape of neoliberal policies, etc. And Oslo, I think, sort of caused a lot of our own political mentors to sort of drop out of the work. Whether it was from a depression or a feeling of defeat, not just Oslo, it was also the Gulf War. And I think that my subconscious was sort of thinking about that moment of struggle and that moment of fear as to what was to come. And I don't think my subconscious in 1995 could foresee that in 2017 things would be actually a lot worse. What we've seen in the Arab world is really an implosion of decades of imperialist policy, both direct and indirect, and suffering, and resistance to that, and extreme state violence. And it all brings us back to this question of US empire, in which people often in this country refuse to acknowledge exists. And I am lucky enough to have traveled and to know that when I go to other countries, people know that US empire exists. It's a part of their consciousness. People here act like it doesn't. So I didn't actually talk about myself that much, but this might be a good point to talk about what I actually do on a day-to-day basis. So my first job was as a high school teacher. in New York City public schools, and then I moved to Chicago where I became a community organizer. And I have been part of the Palestinian rights movement in the United States for the past 15 years or so, with organizations such as Al-Auda, the Palestine Right to Return Coalition, U.S. Palestine Community Network, among other things. I'm also a trained lawyer, and Fidel Castro was a lawyer, if you recall. I remember years ago actually reading transcribed text of one of his legal arguments, in which he was using the courts as a way to bring the narrative of the oppressed and as a way to delegitimize the regime or the system that was facilitating oppression through these courts and through these laws. And I've seen that kind of resistance by revolutionary lawyers in places like Egypt and in Turkey. I've been fortunate enough to have worked in Egypt in the 90s, and then again as a legal worker just a few years before the uprising in Egypt that took place 6 years ago. I also have been very fortunate to have the opportunity to go live in India, where I was working in solidarity with trade unionists in the automobile industry. And so I try to live my life in a way that represents this idea of solidarity and internationalism. I know I never made it to Cuba, but I did make it to Venezuela in 2006 under the invitation of the Chicago Venezuelan embassy. And with full knowledge of how Venezuela's own movement and revolution was inspired by what took place in Cuba. And a few years later, actually just a few years ago, I recall going to a meeting with Venezuelan jurists who came at the invitation of one of my Latina comrades. And just not having much to do that afternoon, awake to listen to what this jurist was talking about in terms of building a court system and developing laws that reflect the revolutionary values that are part of the Venezuelan movement or a part of a global movement for social justice. And I recall being in the car afterwards along with my colleague and another colleague who was a famous Venezuelan lawyer, the author of the Chavez Code, Eva Gollinger is her name. And sort of for a moment realizing that because of the intense sort of presence of US imperialism and the violence that comes with imperialism, that we have lived, people like myself have lived our lives often sort of reacting to every moment of the occupation, to every war that has befallen Iraq or Lebanon or Yemen, every uprising. And we're reacting to that, and we're reacting to the backlash that then gets fallen on our communities through war and terror policies and surveillance and entrapment, etc. And so in all of that reaction, we've never had the time to think about the theory and think about, you know, what could we build if we were free from this kind of imperialism and state violence. And it was refreshing to be in a room to talk about what the Venezuelan Constitution says and what the Cuban Constitution says. And even what the Puerto Rican Constitution says, which is a bit of an improvement from what we have, and to talk about what it means to build courts, or to build a system, or to build restorative justice in a way that can reflect these values, right? And so I think part of the importance of Cuba's legacy is that it provides us with a model, right? It's a model for social justice and for social revolution. That, you know, we can always have, you know, in our consciousness, that we'll always have in our history, and we'll always have on our mind and in our theory, right? And it helps us to sort of like push us in the direction of where we want to go. But Castro is also, for individuals like me, who've never seen him in person, and maybe at a very young age, when I was rushing to see him at Jimmy's Bronx Cafe, I didn't really know much about, at that age, what was really going on in Cuba. But he was a strong, gigantic symbol of anti-imperialism. And he continues to be that to this day. When he died, there were Arabs that mourned, throughout Palestine, throughout the world, actually, in their communities. Even in this small city of Karak, in the south of Jordan, the residents of the city held a Beit Azza, which basically is a gathering when someone dies to mourn the passing of that person, which is either done at someone's home or it's done in the town hall. And there was a Beit Azza that was held in Karak on behalf of Castro. And people were mourning his passing, and I think in a lot of ways they felt like that they were mourning hope, and the hope that Cuba and Castro and the revolution was able to sort of provide us, like, you know, as we continue to sort of battle the forces of imperialism. But that hope is not gone. I mean, that hope needs to be rebuilt, and that hope needs to be sustained. I know that sounds very pessimistic, but the truth is that that's what Castro's death sort of meant for a lot of people. There's a great sadness, and this idea that, like, a period of time that in which internationalist struggle and solidarity of the weak against the powerful forces of imperialism and capitalism, it makes us think that perhaps that time has really passed. So we have to show them that it hasn't, right? And we have to show them that time has not passed by really reclaiming internationalism, because there's an internationalism that exists now, but it's co-opted by liberalist politics, by liberalism, right? And you see that in the Palestinian movement. So the Palestinian movement finally, thank you so much, after all these years, you're recognizing that Palestinians have rights, right? Okay, that's great. And the BDS movement, awesome. I'm so happy that it has so much popularity around the world. But Palestinians have the right to resist their occupation. And do not stand there and say, well, you know, I'm privileged and I don't think that I should be able to tell Palestinians that they should use armed resistance and blah, blah, blah. No. It is grounded actually in international and customary law, and is grounded in morality of humanity, that people under colonial oppression have the right to resist. A new and broadened and widened internationalist movement in support of Palestine, which would like to reserve the discussion and discourse of Palestine to the question of rights, and to dismiss a discussion of the right to resist. I looked at one of those interviews on your website, and when they spoke to Castro about armed struggle, he said, armed struggle might not be the only way, but it was the only way for Cuba, because we only had two choices: suffer or die. And people will support Palestinians as long as they remain victims, as long as we don't fight back. And that's not the kind of international solidarity that we need to build. And I think I'm probably running out of time, so okay, so I just wanted to, because I don't want to get into a sort of like, you know, I can talk about Palestine for days, you know? The thing is that we are a few days away from the anniversary of the 25th of January uprising in Egypt. And we, just a few days, a couple of weeks ago, 6 years of the uprising in Egypt. The uprising still continues despite the extreme sort of repression that has taken place as a result of the counter-revolution. There's an uprising that remains in Bahrain. There's a war being waged in Yemen, which is devastating and illegal. And all of this is grounded in historical and contemporary U.S. imperialism. I don't mean to simplify things. There are many layers to everything that's going on. But we are in the empire, and we need to make sure people know that the empire exists. And you know, I was happy to be invited to come here today because I didn't feel comfortable going to the Women's March in DC. Perhaps I would have had a better experience if I stayed in New York and was part of my comrade contingent, who are always there to disrupt sort of the liberalist anti-Trump actions that are going on, and not to disrupt, but to disrupt. But really to let them know that we will not be silenced. And I know that with all this talk of intersectionality, which is important, that the one thing that's always omitted from these discussions of intersectionality is the war on terror and the effects of war. I heard yesterday someone say that it cost $55 billion for 1 year of sustaining the Afghan war. We have been engaged in the Afghan war for 15 years. That's 15 times 55 billion, which need to go to this neighborhood. This is enough. So, I told people I never voted for Obama, I would never vote for Hillary, and I would never vote for Trump. This country got the president it deserved. This empire got the president it deserved. And so I need for comrades like yourself to really help me and others along in thinking about theory, and thinking about action, and thinking about how we can continue our movement in a way that is revolutionary, in a way that honors the legacy of Cuba, honors the legacy of Palestinian resistance and resistance everywhere, but that will not get sucked in and wiped off by this liberal resurgence that has been happening that's called anti-Trumpism. So I'm so thankful to be able to come here today and participate in this kind of reflection. It got me reading, and that's what I want to do for some time. And so thank you very much for allowing me to be here.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I'm Sharon Sobukwe. I spent the better part of my adult life organizing with the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, a party in which many of you probably know Kwame Ture was very close to Fidel. In 1990, through the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, I had the opportunity to meet with, I think you were there too, Asantwa, meet with many women in the struggling in revolutionary Pan-African women's wings in London. And whether women were from Mozambique or Angola, whether they were from, at the time, Eritrea or South Africa, Ania, PAC or ANC, BCMA, ZAPO, or whether they were women from Sinn Féin, what was incredibly fascinating and important to know was that we had all been influenced by the struggles of women in the Federation of Cuban Women, people like Vilma Espin, and we had all studied the continuous work of the women in the Federation of Cuban Women and how they developed and struggled within Cuban society. And one of the things that really struck me and was one of the major outcomes of our meeting and work was, within our party at least, continued struggle around this concept of social revolution. And I really think about Cuba, when I reflect on Cuba, I reflect from the perspective of Cuba's great contribution to our understanding, theoretically, ideologically, and practically, of what it means to really create, let me hold this, because I feel like you probably can't hear me, what it means to really develop social revolution. So I wrote, I usually don't read, but I'm afraid I might not have time. And even reading, I might not have time. But I hope you'll bear with me. So when I talk about social revolution, I tend to think that revolutionaries understand social revolution to be the basis and process for holistic transformation of life for the people. So social revolution is a part and a component of political and economic revolution. But social revolution deals primarily on the level of superstructure, ideological superstructure. It's a process to transform the systems of society in which poverty, wars, insecurity, and all the evils existing and arising from the economic nature of capitalism to its very end, once and for all. Such change requires fundamental cultural and ethical change. From the depraved values of greed, individualism, and exploitation characteristic of imperialism, to a new social order, one founded upon revolutionary principles of egalitarianism, humanism, and collectivism. So socialism is, first and foremost, an ideological transformation. And this transformation must become evident in practice. The social revolution is the praxis of ideological transformation without which there can be no revolution. Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah put it this way: social revolution must therefore have standing firmly behind it an intellectual revolution, a revolution in which our thinking and philosophy are directed toward redemption of our society. This requires two aims. First, the restitution of the egalitarianism of human society. And second, the logistical mobilization of all our resources towards the attainment of that restitution. What is called for as a first step is a body of connected thought which will determine the general nature of our action. So social revolution, as I understand it, occurs within a process of constant political education. Constant political education to develop revolutionary consciousness. Here, the theory and practice of revolution are to be rigorously engaged to transform the particular conditions of state institutions, social structures, and the hearts and minds of people. So social revolution, I believe, is the process of changing regular social arrangements in society, those which come from and determine the actions of individuals. Social revolution should invigorate social ties between individuals and society, engaging them in constant organization for individual and social development. In socialism, revolutionary parties and governments target capitalist state institutions, redirecting them from exploiting the resources of the people so that they benefit the formerly oppressed classes within imperialism. They are to restore the power of people to deploy the institutions and resources for the state for the human development and growth of the society. The revolutionary state must change laws and government structures that perpetuate exploitation and oppression, but that's not enough. Social revolution must transform oppressive social structures like class structure, racism, sex and gender oppression, as well as social institutions such as families that foster abuse and exploitation. So within this process, social revolution organically reshapes the norms, values, and thus behaviors of individuals within the social system. In my view, in modern times, the Cuban Revolution, under the revolutionary leadership of Fidel Castro, is our shining example of social revolution. I'll give you 3 reasons to get out of the way. First, from the Cuban Revolution, we learn what it means for the revolutionary to genuinely love the people. Cuba's commitment to her people is reflected in the revolutionary transformation of the people's lives, and this is unassailable. We've heard statistics, we've heard stories of just how deep the commitment to the Cuban people goes, to restoration of the history of struggle, the history of class struggle, beginning even before the communist revolution. The Cuban commitment to socialist revolution and transforming the very conditions of people's lives goes to, as I suggested, the women's struggles. Cuba's regular and consistent commitment to getting it right, to challenging the values and the morals of men and women alike, to begin to see what it takes to bring women into the labor force within Cuba has been studied around the world by revolutionaries, especially revolutionary women. And so they've eliminated, as we said, illiteracy, universalized free education, advanced health care, eradicated institutions that foster racist, sexist, and sexual sectarianism. The right of every Cuban to employment, education, health care, and a proper diet and decent housing, and producing a healthier black population than any other place in the world. is a real act of love. Women who were only 9% of the employed, mostly as maids and prostitutes, have become vital members of the labor force in occupations throughout the economy, not only those that women have traditionally served. In Cuba, child care is also free to support them, and that matters. Good, safe, healthy child care is something we all long for, and if we are truly revolutionary, we recognize that providing for our children is important, but we cannot, as capitalism would have us, pit our children against our women, born or unborn. And so, first, Cuba teaches us that love of the people has to have tangible results. Love of the people has to result in transforming their lives. Secondly, we can learn from the Cuban Revolution how to develop revolutionary consciousness as a means to grapple with internal contradictions. While some Marxists have criticized Cuba as a revolution from the top, Cuba has, as has been stated, and Fidel Castro has himself said, committed to continuous political education. Cuba has developed revolutionary consciousness from the ground up. We know that from the beginning, 90% at least of the population supported the revolution against Batista. When the CIA-backed exiles tried to invade Cuba, they learned just this fact in April 1961, when they were routed by Cuban forces and the armed Cuban population at the Bay of Pigs. Further, since the US blockade in 1962, what has saved Cuba, according to Castro, has been the support of the people as much as it has been the support of the Soviet Union until 1991. And during this special period, Cuba has creatively modeled efficiency, frugality, and environmental responsibility. Recycling, repairing, reusing, all in ways that we could all stand to replicate. And Cuba still survives. That's the most important thing. In spite of it all, with the noose around Cuba's neck, it still survives. And so when asked why, Castro himself responded, because the revolution always had, has, and increasingly will have the support of a nation, an intelligent populace, which is increasingly united, educated, and combative. And so this Cuban model of political participation reflects a commitment to direct popular participation. Power holders are subjected to periodic elections, and the committees for the defense of the revolution, like other community or barrio-based organizational expressions of people power, we could definitely argue are the basis for a vibrant civil society. So regardless of what liberal politics and liberal democratic politics tell us, democracy does not have to look like what it looks like here. Democracy does not have to look like sham elections that reproduce a duopoly every 4 years. And we can learn from Cuba's mistakes and weaknesses. For many African Americans like me, Fidel Castro immediately had our special support. When he exiled only white Cubans, when he took up residence in, of course, the Hotel Teresa and met with Malcolm X. But also, when he and Cuba embraced our black revolutionaries like Assata Shakur and others, not only accepting them, but protecting them and refusing to give them up. Any African American of consciousness knows that Cuba is a friend of African people in America or anywhere around the world. So in this way, Castro has modeled opposition to racism, and the revolutionary government quickly eliminated institutional racism early in its history. However, Castro himself has been said, has admitted that they underestimated the resilience of racism. Some argue that a more robust civil society where interest groups can advocate for changes may have created better conditions for Afro-Cubans by now. However, Cuba, like so many others, has been especially careful of creating openings for their imperialist neighbor to the north, which roams the earth looking for all it can devour. In the Cuban model, the CDRs were to provide the vehicle for such struggle. Yet such decisions are made in the heat of political strategy, often in the light of external conditions. And so, that Castro has admitted this error, among many others, is a reflection of his humility, as so many have said. It is a reflection of the revolutionary character of Castro, as well as the Cuban Revolution. As revolutionaries, we have to take seriously learning from those who've exceeded and those who failed around this critical issue, asking how do revolutionaries defend the revolution from without and within simultaneously. Overcoming internal contradictions is fundamental. As the revolutionary leader of the national liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau, Amilcar Cabral reminds us in The Weapon of Theory, one form of struggle which we consider to be fundamental. We refer here to the struggle against our own weaknesses. Our experiences have shown us that in the general framework of the daily struggle, this battle against ourselves, no matter what difficulties the enemy may create, is the most difficult of all, whether for the present or for the future of our people. This battle is the expression of the internal contradictions in the economic, social, cultural, and therefore historical reality of each of our countries. We are convinced that in any national or social revolution which is not based on knowledge of this fundamental reality runs the grave risk of being condemned to failure. When the African peoples say in their simple language that no matter how hot the water from your well, it will not cook your rice, they express with singular simplicity a fundamental principle of not only physics, but also of political science. We know that the development of a phenomenon in movement, whether its internal appearance, whatever its internal appearance, depends mainly on its internal characteristics. We would be wise in the US to recognize that here our internal contradictions are critical. Again, Cabral says, we also know that on the political level, our own reality, however fine and attractive the reality of others may be, can only be transformed by detailed knowledge of it, by our own efforts, by our own sacrifices. Social revolution is essentially determined and formed by the historical reality of each people and carried to success by the overcoming or correct solution of that internal contradiction between the various categories characterizing this reality. The success of the Cuban Revolution, Cabral says, taking place only 90 miles from the greatest imperialist and anti-socialist power of all time, seems to us in its content and its way of evolution to be a practical and conclusive illustration of the validity of this point. Our internal weaknesses are our greatest challenge, or our greatest strength. From Castro and Cuban Revolution, we also learned the essential value of solidarity for the anti-imperial revolution. Cuba's approach has been to establish early a commitment to solidarity as an organizational principle. For Cuba, solidarity with revolutionary national liberation movements and governments was to not only contribute to a bulwark against imperialism and their geopolitical strategies, but for humanity to encourage the development of freedom, equality, and to challenge the degradation of humanity by imperialism globally. Cuba saw solidarity as a means of developing revolutionary consciousness and commitment to the oneness of the human struggle, not only among those Cuba supported, but even within the Cuban Revolution. Solidarity has been Cuba's visible commitment to socialist human development as an ongoing revolutionary process. Castro has led Cuba in providing material assistance to national liberation forces across Africa and Latin America, and medical and educational aid, especially to children on the Isle of Youth, but also medical aid to poor cities within these United States, through students that Pastors of Peace have supported, who've gone to Cuba for medical education and come back and serve the poor and those who are suffering and struggling, even here in the belly of the beast. Moreover, Castro took a leadership role in the non-aligned movement, which Cuba hosted in 1979 and 2006, and in the more radical Organization of Solidarity with the People of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, ASPAL, which is based in Havana. Cuba hosted the Tricontinental Meeting 50 years ago, where Castro said that his government would coordinate support for revolutionary wars of liberation throughout the colonized world. As we know and have heard, Che Guevara was in Congo from the beginning, working with African revolutions. Cuba provided material support in terms of military and medical training to Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and especially Angola, where Cuban militants helped defeat Portugal and summon Portugal's own Carnation Revolution against its fascist state in 1974. And then in Angola, Cuba played a critical role in defeating the South African military at the 1988 Battle of Quito Carnaval, breaking the back of the South African apartheid regime. And so Castro and Cuba's contribution to the world and history are beyond modeling humanistic development and providing important military and material support. Castro and the Cuban Revolution challenged revolutionaries to think deeply and act in new creative ways to address lasting dialectical challenges inherent in building socialist revolution. We must study how Cuba has grappled with managing internal and external contradictions and courageously chosen to integrate domestic and international solidarity for the development of the revolution. As Castro said, we had to educate, sow ideas, build awareness, instill feelings of solidarity, and a genuine, generous internationalist spirit. Our people would not have had strength to resist without these. Finally, a poem from one of Cuba's bright stars, a Black woman, Nancy Moreholm. Her poem, Black Women. I still smell the foam of the sea that made me cross. The night, I cannot remember it. The ocean itself could not remember that. But I can't forget the first gull I made out in the distance. High, the clouds, like innocent eyewitnesses. Perhaps I haven't forgotten my lost coast, nor my ancestral language. They left me here, and here I've lived. And because I worked like an animal, here I came to be born. How many Mandingo epics did I look to for strength? I rebelled. His worship brought me in a public square. I embroidered his worship's coat and bore him a male child. My son had no name. All his worship died, and his worship died at the hands of an impeccable English lord. I walked. This is the land where I suffered, mouth in the dust and the lash. I rode the length of all its rivers. Under its sun, I planted seeds, brought in the crops, but never ate those harvests. A slave barracks was my house, built with stones that I hauled myself. When I sang the pure beat of native birds, I rose up. In this same land, I touched the fresh blood and decayed bones of many others, brought to this land or not, the same as I. I no longer dreamt of the road to Guinea. Was it to Guinea, Benin, to Madagascar, or Cape Verde? I walked on and on. I strengthened the foundation of my millenary song and of my hope. I left for the hills. My real independence was the free slave port, and I rode with the troops of Maceo. Only a century later, together with my descendants from a blue mountain, I came down from the Sierra to put an end to capital and usurer, to generals and to bourgeoisie. Now I exist. Only today do we own, do we create. Nothing is foreign to us. The land is ours. Ours the sea and sky, the magic and vision, compañeros, Here, I see you dance around the tree we are planting for communism. Its prodigal wood resounds.
Much for sharing your experiences. It was very powerful because to me, it just showed how Cuba and Fidel Castro's revolution was international. It wasn't just important for one people. It was global, and so that was very powerful. And I just want to thank you again for sharing your time and your experiences. Now we're going to open it up to you guys for questions and remarks. So if you have a question or remark, I would ask that you would raise your hand and come and ask your question up front here, please. You, ma'am. You, yeah, right here. You can have it.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Asantua Nkrumah Toure, and revolutionary thank you to the organizers for this event, Dr. Montero, and revolutionary Happy New Year to all of you, and I look forward to working with all of you in the new year, because this weekend marks, we got work to do, y'all, okay? My question is for Sister Ania. This is a little off topic, but I've always been very curious. Dr. King once spoke about solidarity with different groups of people around the world, including those in India and other parts of that part of the world. Do you have any information or reflections about Manu Manchanda? He was a friend and comrade of Mama Claudia Jones.
No. I wish I did. You could look it up. So, do you know anything? I mean, can you give any more information? Because probably.
No, I've only recently been reading about their relationship. They were both in the Communist Party in Great Britain, and when Claudia Jones was deported from the U.S., because she was born in Trinidad and Tobago, rather than going to Trinidad and Tobago,
and then she ended up in
she wound up in Great Britain.
Yeah.
But they were longtime comrades and friends, and there's a lot with that and other things about people of African descent and solidarity with other peoples that we really need to explore further.
Right. Well, I mean, I know somebody, I can get you the name of somebody who's writing a biography of Claudia Jones. So she may actually know something. But about those kind of connections between Marxists and revolutionaries between Africa and India, there's a lot of stuff. But this particular person, I don't know. If he was part of the Marxists in England, and then they met. I mean, so there are lots of people, including South African Marxists, who ended up living in London. And so the whole connections went they're quite crazy when you start following them up. But I can get you the name of the person who's doing this. Yeah, the biography. Okay.
Hi everybody, I'm Elias Gonzalez, and I wanted to thank everybody who had spoken today, because, and mine is just a remark, I don't really have a question, only because as a Afro-Latino too, I'm Dominican. I think what fails to happen is kind of that talk about Latin America and Afro Latinx and all that stuff. And just hearing about internationalism and that kind of stuff, which Huey talks about, and we talk about at Brock and the Black Radical Tradition Conference and all that jazz, and Saturday Free School all the time. I think this kind of conference, and I just really want to give like a big thanks and kind of point to that, how it's really important what Castro did and what I'm learning. You know what I mean? I just sat here and I just listened and learned so much. You know, I didn't have to pay. You know what I mean? You just save so much money, right?
Yes.
But I just think that it's important to think about that internationalism, which I think, you know, people, what I find here is that we get stuck, like we're, you know, in the belly of the beast, like we say. So it's hard for us to kind of see outside of our own realities right now. So having this conference and thinking about Cuba, which I have a list of books to read, which I've been like, you know, really needing to get back on, I just think it's really inspiring and really something that you don't hear about ever, you know, except for this instance where Cuba is really doing the work and really showing that it's an exemplary, like, it's possible, you know what I mean, at some level, at whatever level. And like they kept saying, these guys, that we have to decide for our own. I think that's also an empowering thing, that, you know, we don't have to just, like, Cuba did it on its own and Cuba decided how they were going to do it, and that we have the power to decide how we're going to take and change and do what we're going to do. And I just wanted to say thanks, you know, for you guys, or you ladies especially, for coming up and talking so much different experience from India, from Palestine, and something that I fight for, because I have arguments with people, not so much anymore, but when I do, about how they just don't want to see outside of their own realities. How you're just like, well, how does this happen? You know, when I'm trying to talk to them about North Philadelphia and how that fits into Palestine, into India, into Cuba, they're like, well, I don't see how that, you know, whatever. So I just think having these conversations are important. I really, 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 from the bottom of my heart, want to thank every person on the panel, because you might not know it, but, you know, this is a new trajectory for me. I'm seeing a whole new thing, and I get obsessive, so it'll just be a whole new thing for me. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much. My question is very broad, but in terms of culture changing and then imperialism changing, I just moved from New York City, the Empire State. Through my life, and I've been alive 40 plus years, I've seen how, and especially recently with the neoliberalism, I've seen that the oppressors or the haves, their activism or their giving up their privilege is posting something on Facebook or saying something nice, you know, and going back to their lives. Or even, I was an artist for 18 years and putting me in their programming so they can say there's diversity in the programming, but not giving me the correct artist fee. That kind of thing. And on the other side, I've seen people want what their oppressors have materially. And when they see the way I live, like, you're an anarchist, are you crusty? That kind of thing. You know, and I also get tempted. I get emails every day, and I open 70% off. But so how do we start to change our mentalities to every morning at 7 o'clock walking your kids to school, or shifting our mentality about values? Because I think this imperialist world is so drowned in, I want to say drowned in it, right? How do we even start to float?
Question.
You want to take that first?
No, that is fine.
You know, I'm glad that, first of all, you brought up this question of acting out our politics on social media. I mean, so social media is like, it's the new party newspaper, it's the new medium, right, for people to communicate with one another. But it has to be really, really critiqued for how it's framing particularly internationalist movements and how it's pushing certain internationalist movements. And, you know, at the moment, between activists in Occupy and activists in Egypt and activists in Chile and activists in Spain, but they were activists who had access to social media and who lived a life of privilege and comfort in which social media was part of how they communicated and how they lived. And that completely excluded the poor and working class of Tunis and Egypt, and migrant workers in the Gulf, and those from which this struggle actually came. Like, you know, not from these Facebook activists. Don't think for a second. Like, you know, and in the case of India, total exclusion of the movement there. I mean, to some extent, from this global conversation that was happening, right? You know, and other places in the global South. And so that's the kind of crutch that social media gives us. And just thank you for bringing up this question of values, right? Because I think we talk about that every day, especially among, you know, my women and queer folks. There's something about that culture that allows us to sort of like talk about that more. And just seeing, like, I see Arab values, Arab cultural values of collectivity and embracing each other and helping each other being destroyed as a result of living in the West and as a result of chasing the comfort of capitalist gains in our countries back home, because there's nothing else, like, you know, to look to or to follow, except perhaps the values that religion still gives us. And you know, and some of the most religious Islamic scholars and Islamicists have some of the most beautiful social justice values that there are there. And there's not a contradiction between the values that come from these long-standing sort of cultural religious ideas. It doesn't have to be. And the same kind of social justice values that we talk about when we talk about social revolution in Cuba. So thank you.
Can I just quickly add something? I want to say I agree with what you're saying, Susan, and I also disagree. And I disagree because the social media, yes, there are people who run they think the revolution is going to come on Facebook, and it isn't. But I disagree very much about who has access and who doesn't have access. In India, we didn't have phone lines. We didn't have the traditional network that the first world had. So when the cell phone first came to India, every poor person who cleans the street and who sells vegetables, who doesn't have a credit card, has a cell phone, okay? And I want to say young people in the middle of the struggle, students in Kashmir, they were uploading police brutality videos on Facebook. So if it wasn't for social media, the Indian government could have covered up much more some of the things. So I want to give a descending note and say, you can use that, okay? We have a prime minister in India who uses Twitter to shut down dissent. But people are hitting back also, okay? So it is not something that I mean, I don't think, these are just mediums, okay? Yes, of course it's global and it's corporate and, you know, we all have, you know, I have somebody sitting here whose account has been shut down because of the kind of things they've posted, because they're too revolutionary for Facebook. So I have no illusions about Facebook, okay? But I do think we have to realize that in India at least, everybody has access, okay? It's completely wrong to say that the poor people in India do not have access to the internet. They have more, they will, that's their safeguard, okay? And it's very strange what has happened in the poor communities in India and unconnected communities. So I don't, you know, I think we have to change our mindset and see what's happening out there also.
And 11-year-old in North Philly got Facebook.
Yeah. So
I wanted to respond from a different perspective. And I think it is true, you know, this issue of ethics and values are fundamental to the revolution. And indeed, what I was trying to say is that they're fundamental to the social revolution. That is indeed where we focus on fundamentally transforming people and behaviors. But I think we have to know that we don't do it by ourselves. We have to do it through, you know, a collective, through conscious struggle with one another, through political education, to develop revolutionary consciousness. And it's too easy to get isolated and to be just bombarded by the values of the dominant culture. We can only take refuge and get stronger with one another. And so we have to be a part of some organized process of continuously struggling and grappling. And if you're an artist, we need you to be strong. The other thing I wanted to say is that social media, indeed, much like religion, and I'm a Christian, a strong believer, can be used for revolution or for reaction. And we just have to be able to recognize, when each of these is being used against or for the people. And we need to be able to critically evaluate that, and again, that comes from always sharpening and honing ourselves in a process of conscious revolutionary struggle.
You had a follow-up?
Oh, I just wanted to not just about Facebook, but it seems like people are like just getting sad about things, or like becoming suicidal because of PTSD about things that are real to some of those people. And just like having emotion about something, and some of us don't get emotional. You're reacting too hard. Work harder. What did you do wrong? You're not allowed to cry. That's more of what it seems like. It seems like these days, getting sad about something is their changes the world. Well, we're not allowed to get sad about it. We're hungry.
Angry.
Thank you. You can come up here. I want to give the mic to this gentleman here.
Yeah, I'd like to put in a plug for real local political action. I think that if we could elect somebody in Philadelphia at the councilmatic level, or just organize a political group of people here in this city, in this neighborhood, that we would act as an antidote to that poison of depression, of give up kind of attitude. And then we would also develop the social media on a local level that would help our organizing enormously. So.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Again, I really appreciate being here, and thank you again to the organizers for organizing this, and thank you, panelists, for all the brilliant commentary. I actually had a question about the Women's March that's happening right now, and I think it's an important thing to talk about. I think Suzanne and Ania, both of you touched on that, and for different reasons, it seemed like there was a division there in terms of what the meaning of this gathering is right now. And going back to Shizu's point about people posting things about being so depressed and sad that Trump got elected, and this entire consolidation of energies under the anti-Trump banner, right? And so much of that is part of how the Democratic Party and the liberal establishment is also seizing on that kind of mass hysteria around this. And so much of it is about portraying Trump as this misogynist and racist, and as though these things didn't already exist before. And suddenly we have a convenient thing to pin the tail on, kind of thing. Exactly. So I'm just wondering, when you say these women's marches are happening all over the country and all over the world and things like that, I find that there's something slightly alarming about it too. Because it feels a little bit like a liberal clapback as well. So I was wondering if you could maybe comment on that. Thank you.
Divya, one of the things revolutionaries have done all their life is also work in joint fronts. Revolutionaries can become sectarian, or they can go out there and argue their way in united fronts. This is a longer conversation, and it has to be decided on a case-to-case basis. There is no absolute rule out there. You can be very pure and sit in your little tower and never get out there, okay? So, like Occupy, which if you remember, some of us, I met Meghna first in Occupy, people called it a white movement. In Philadelphia, it didn't stay a white movement because of people like Meghna and others who went out there. TJ is sitting here, all of us were there. and created a People of Color Coalition, and Philadelphia is that kind of city. And so, yeah. So you have to, I mean, I think that this Women's March was controversial from the very beginning. It had lots and lots of problems. Lots of people critiqued it, right? So I can't, you know, and it was also very amorphous. So by the end, what I saw there today in Philadelphia, and the people who were talking there today in Philadelphia, it was, I thought, something that did not smack of, I mean, look, I teach global feminism. I'm very aware of the kind of exclusions that white feminism, white liberal feminists have, you know, historically enacted, not to mention, by the way, nationalism in this. You can be a black radical in the United States and still exclude a lot of women from a lot of parts of the world, right? But I think that right now, yes, you can go there and say it's a liberal backlash and it's all the same. And yeah, I mean, maybe it is, but there are lots of people there who are groping for a vocabulary and for an action and something to do, and they were there as well.
Did you want to be fine? You sure?
Great stall. Thank you, Professor Tony, for inviting me, and thank you for the panelists. And it's for a long time, Cuban activists, we have not seen this city for a long time. It's about time. My question, basically, I'm interested three of you to answer it. I'm a Muslim. I'm particularly interested by Saudi Arabia's role in dismantling social revolution in Middle East. The three alliances, US, Israel, Saudi Arabia, play a major role in fermenting anti-social, for social justice in Middle East, in Africa, in Middle East cases. I'm a Muslim. I will tell you about that one in Middle East cases. First of all, Muslims, they go to Mecca whenever they can, they say. But now Saudi Arabia is saying that you must go every year. Who owns the hotel? The Saudi Arabia Kingdom owns it. Now Trump is going to build a hotel there in Mecca. Yes. In Mecca. Now I tell my brother Muslims, rather going to Mecca, why don't you go to your home country, contribute for your family? But the Quran says that if you go to Mecca, only if you can, not you must. That should be preference. That what you must means came Saudi Arabia. The Triple Alliance, Saudi Arabia made a major role in dismantling social justice in Middle East. They hijack the Middle East plan for their own sake. I'll tell you why. In order to pay attention to Saudi Arabia, now if they liberate Al-Quds with Jerusalem, people may go to Al-Quds, Jerusalem, for visit. They may not go to Mecca. Saudi Arabia want to maintain the Islamic hegemony. You must go only to Mecca under my own condition. Their condition is that called Wahhabism. They call it Wahhabism. I have never seen any US politicians in the Congress or outside mention the word Wahhabism. They call it Islamic radicals. They call it Shiite, what's called terrorists. The Wahhabis, Saudi Arabia played a major role in Israel, in Middle East, and other part of Islam, especially in Pakistan now because of Wahhabism. Saudi Arabia in 1980 with Zbigniew Brzezinski, they facilitate this dismantling Pakistan and Afghanistan. We should be mentioned when they said Islam, you should separate. The Wahhabi consistently play with the Western world dismantling social justice. In Nigeria, Boko Haram, Wahhabism. In Somalia, Al-Shabaab, Wahhabism. Today, if I send $100 to Somali, US will ask me, why did you send it? But the Middle East, Bahrain, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, they said, millions of dollars to Somalia and Nigeria. They never ask them. So we should show that about that one here. I'm sorry I gave a speech, but anybody can ask a question, especially about the Modi in right-wing Indian government. Also play a major role now, is playing a major role to dehumanize the other ethnic groups. They make Hinduism is the official religion in Egypt. So we will comment all of you. I'm sorry, guys.
You want to respond? Go ahead. I just want to say thank you to the brother that just spoke. And also I just want to say that I agree with you. I misspoke. I didn't mean to imply that the poor in India don't have access to. I'm aware of the way that it's used, cell phones and WhatsApp and Facebook for organizing. What I meant to say was that I felt like that there was a global conversation in which, say, social media is part of the medium in which it's done, in which India's never really brought into their analysis.
But there's another conversation in India.
Yeah, absolutely,
Remember,
absolutely.
There are other
Yeah, exactly.
conversations.
Which
It's
they're
not
not.
global because it's American.
Exactly. That's the point I'm trying to make. That it's not really global because it's not considering the rest of the global
Yeah,
south,
but let's
right?
not call it global. It's just American.
Oh, absolutely. It's American and it's also elite from the people outside of America who are participating in it. So that was the point that I was trying to make. Absolutely. But I just want to say, yeah, thank you to the brother. I mean, you know, I don't know why Arab communities in the U.S. and throughout the world have not been protesting at Saudi embassies for years, right? It was almost like the analysis was there, but it never really was there. And I think that part of the, part of the huge challenge in, building these social values, these revolutionary values, and sort of rebuilding something that we can call a revolutionary movement in these societies is the fact that as a result of the implosion of imperial state violence and imperial economic violence, we have a situation where people in the region have to choose between their dictators or the West's dictators, right? And it's the only choice that we are left, right? And are really trying to sort of think about what it means, to build a movement that reflects these values in an era when extremism actually is becoming more of a problem, right? And for years we didn't really want to say it because we know of how the US and their imperialist designs helped to ferment this extremism, right? Going back to Afghanistan and continuing on today. But the fact of the matter is that we still have to live day to day with this extremism. I was just telling my friend who's in the audience, my Iraqi sister who's in the audience, that on New Year's Eve, one of my distant relatives was killed in the attack by the Islamic State that took place in Istanbul. And that was something that was bound to happen, and something that we have to think about, and it's something that we have to figure now into our theory and in our strategy. The fact that this kind of extremism does exist. Thank you, Empire. It does exist, right? And it affects our day-to-day living in those societies too. To being able to go out on the street, dressed in a particular way, etc. And we can't ignore it by just saying, oh, well, I'm anti-imperialist. So, US is responsible for this extremism. Extremism is there and we have to contend with it.
Yeah. Thank you. Your friend had his hand up first. Okay, he said you could go.
Thank you. This is a very interesting time. And there's a lot going on, and I think I want to address Ania. We have to ask the question, who and for what? who are we fighting for and what are our objectives? We can join any demonstration, and there'll be a lot of them. But who are we fighting for and for what are we fighting? If Hillary Clinton, whom I considered the most dangerous politician in the world, had won, there would hardly been a sound of protest. People are outraged that suddenly fascism has arrived. But the last time I looked, there were 2.5 million people locked up in this country. You know what I'm saying? A good-looking, suave president and his beautiful wife had a kill list. There was not a Christian or white person on it. They were Muslims. Talk about Islamophobia. I think we're in a battle right now over whether a neoliberal managerial elite, which took a serious blow on November 8th, can recover their previous status. When the CIA and politicians connected to the CIA warn the president-elect, now president, you better be careful. There are things, there are signs that tell us something. And we know about color revolutions. And I think, and this is, I feel deeply about it, could be wrong, that there's something going on out here that has not a lot to do with the welfare of the working class and the poor. And for that reason, the working class and the poor are not seen in the demonstrations. Or are they included in the demands of the demonstrators? Even the, well, let me just say this. Even the left-wing demonstrators that I saw yesterday. It's so interesting that suddenly the black question is not in the equation. They talk about racism, but that could mean anything. But they do not hit on the fundamental question of American society, going back to Du Bois, the oppression of the African American people. So I would say this: we all should march for those things that we believe in and for values that we hold dear. But I do think we need a deeper debate. And I, for one, am not going to be forced into marching. And I'm not saying... No, you dig what I'm saying? I'm just saying...
I mean, you're addressing me.
No, I'm not really. And I don't mean, I'm not addressing you in a contentious way. I'm addressing you in a discursive manner. And I'm saying an atmosphere that says that if you don't march, you're a co-conspirator with fascism. No, there are people who say that now. I had a debate up at a person's house last weekend where they were going to say any critique of what they were doing from the quote left, meant you were conspiring with fascism. I said, well, what were we conspiring with for the last 8 years or the last 25 years? What is fascism? Are we, you know what I'm saying, Anna? Are we living under something that Hitler and Mussolini would have admired? Who set up the national security state? So I think, you know what I'm saying? There is a moment where the line has to be drawn in the sand, and it's along the class and race line. And good, I'll stop there. You dig my point. I think this is about the people who lost. The people who lost, and the trauma of that defeat, which was supposed to never happen, saying that we're going to find a way either to get back or to bring this guy down. And the other thing, the last thing, all of this anti-Russia thing. in all of these marches. And everybody knows what that means. The anti-Putin, I lived through the Cold War, you know what I'm talking about, Ania. They never targeted a leader of the Soviet Union personally the way they're targeting Trump. Literally saying that they have a right to overthrow the Russian government and kill the leader of Russia because he is an existential threat to American democracy. I'll stop there, you know.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I don't think that by arguing that there is a space for joint action, I can be guilty of misreading what the last, not only 8 years, but half century in the United States has been about in terms of the incarceral state, in terms of its connection with neoliberalism. It's not going to change. Let me give you an example from India, since the brother earlier brought up Modi and what's going on with Muslims, okay? The neoliberalism in India today was ushered in by the Congress government, not by the right-wing government in power today. The right-wing government actually gave a line of indigenous stuff and, talked a kind of anti-global talk, even while at the back of it, it was making exactly the same alliances with corporations and doing exactly the same thing that the earlier government was doing. But there was a difference. When Modi came to power, we really felt Muslims will be lynched. Muslims were lynched. There was a genocide against Muslims. They can't get housing now. Inch by inch by inch, we can see democratic freedoms being taken away. Not that they were not imperiled earlier, okay? But having lived through the last 4 years in India, or not even 4 years, it's only been maybe not even 3 years since he came to power. Students and teachers, it's going the way of Turkey, okay? The backslide is so fast that we don't know what hit us, okay? And I'm saying there are freedoms and then there are freedoms, and we're going to have to find our way. I have no illusion about either the Obama administration or what lay earlier, okay? But I do know when they talk about the war on the undocumented and the war on Muslims, and as an educator, I know that suddenly they can come into my classroom and drag people away. Of course they could do it earlier. But suddenly it feels different. Reproductive justice rights, I'm sorry, but it may be very bourgeois of me, but I'm going to go out there and fight for it every chance that I get, no matter with whom, okay? And if that makes me less revolutionary, so be it.
That was not the argument was not about less and more revolutionary. But it was not about more or less revolutionary. Okay, if you want to.
But it also seems that there is a lot of politics of distraction going on, because one of the things it seems that this election has shown more than anything else is that it has unveiled the duopoly. If you're watching, right? That, it's both Democrats and Republicans who are really espousing the same anti-Putin line. It's both Democrats and Republicans who are at the same time, who've had the same foreign policy for years, and it's just incredibly clear now. But a lot of this kind of liberal misdirection and use of the means of social movements is really a politics of distraction, and it seems that there's plenty for us to really struggle to show the people in terms of how clear it is. I think for the first time in a long time, how much the Democrats and the Republicans are the same.
Well, yes,
exactly.
they are. They have no illusion about that.
Great, thank you. Dr. Montero, how much time do we have? 15 minutes. Any more questions? Come on. Oh, no, you come. You come. And then you, okay? Together.
I think it's very important that we take about 5 minutes to sort of think about this conversation about the relevance of the march. Because I'm confused. Coming here today, I live in Washington, D.C. And coming here today, we just happened to count 743 buses of very diversified men and women on the road to Washington, D.C. When we left, about 8:15, there were 700,000 people on the streets. A number of different women from all different stratas came to my house in my neighborhood and all over Washington. They're not Democrats, they're not Republicans, you know, they're concerned about their future. And I understand this dialogue between you and Tony. I don't think we're trying to criticize you personally. But let me finish. Let me finish. I think.
Personal. I mean, I don't take it personally at all.
No, good. I'm glad.
I'm fighting with you.
I like the response. But let me say this. There's a lot of people who have moved into political action because they are concerned about their future. They're not Republicans or they're not Democrats. You know, they're concerned about what they see taking place. And I think here we have a much more advanced political culture and understanding. But where does that come from? That comes from action. That comes from contradiction. That comes from struggle. So I'm not really sure, and I'm glad that I'm here to be able to put the question forward, you know, that I'm sort of happy to see 1 million women or 1 million people in downtown Washington because we know that a large amount of these people will have to continue to struggle, continue to grow, and maybe then they can move more to a better political understanding, because we all realize that the American society and the American population, particularly whites, are very politically naive. And now in this period of history, they got to answer some serious questions. And so I think it's important that maybe we might be on the sidelines and watch do their growth and their battle. I want to hear people's response from that.
Okay. You guys gonna respond? No. Okay. Come
That was an amazing panel. I just want to start with that. This conversation has been amazing and intense, and I expected no less. I will say, just a quick comment about the march. I went this morning because it was also a politically anthropological kind of moment for me to just see what was happening. It was huge, right? And that was breathtaking, and also breathtaking in a strangulation kind of way, because where I was at the head of the march, and we were surrounded entirely by folks who wouldn't be at the marches we usually march around this side of town for. So, but then again, I kept coming up with buts. This was a morning of buts, in many senses of the term. But I looked up at the stage and I saw older social work students who had graduated. It was an entirely African-American, African-based celebration. But then I looked around and a friend of mine was next to me and had a sign that said, I would have protested Clinton too, right? And then, but a lot of people came up to her and cursed her out for that. But in the middle of the march, as I was there, I was trying to look for Ania and Suvir and some of my friends there, and I actually caught sight of them, and I couldn't go because I run a center for carceral communities for people coming out of prison. One of them had cycled over, and he wasn't interested in the march. None of my clients came to the march. None of the community folks came to the march. He was interested in figuring out how to talk to his PO tomorrow, because he might get prison for 3 years because he smoked marijuana yesterday, right? So I was speaking to them, by the way, as you walk past Whole Foods. I couldn't reach out to you in time. So there were interesting moments today. I think it was interesting. There were people that I totally connected with at the march. We are all terrified. There are people who have, and these are the same people who were terrified when Obama came to power the second time, especially, right? When Clinton called us super predators, right? There are also people who had no idea why we would be up against Clinton and Obama. So it was an interesting moment. I just wanted to share that. Also, I wanted to say, I'm a social worker, and we're constantly plagued by this question about where we are subsumed into the system through service, through making people survive at the basic level, versus social change. And I want to say, to come back to Castro, he really had a template for that, which was quite interesting. Cuba, and I mentioned this in the last conference that I was at, Cuba, this template was used by the Black Panther Party here. Because Cuba actually trained hundreds of thousands of doctors for free. And that is the basic rubric of the medical care system in the entire Middle and South Americas today. Okay? And I will tell you that that is the basis, if I would venture it from a social work perspective, that laid the foundation for many of those revolutions. Basic healthcare. This is why the Black Panther Party, using that template, started its kitchens, its food service program in the communities. And it was actually referenced. So I think these questions where we're all walking the line and we're all constantly going to drop off it one way or the other, and we just have to keep analyzing exactly where our strategies are. And I think this morning was an interesting reminder of that.
Okay, I first want to make a comment about the survival programs of the Black Panther Party, since you mentioned it. Reformism versus revolutionary action. And one of the functions of the survival programs was not so much just to serve the people, because of course we knew many people needed food, etc., but it was also to raise their consciousness. It was to educate the people. And this is what I really wanted to make a comment about relative to the marches. I don't think that we can really afford not to be clear about what the purpose of any march is, but especially these that are going on now. One thing I understand is that there are many different contingencies within this Women's March and the march yesterday. Nobody's really clear. Someone who's sitting on the sidelines in their living room somewhere may not really understand why these organizations are out there, other than what CNN, MSNBC, Fox News will define them to be, what their purpose is. And that's what's really problematic. One thing that was spoken about earlier today in terms of the Cuban Revolution and what continues, it's the role of political education. And one thing that when the Black Panther Party was organizing in the Black communities, and our example was followed by others, the masses were clear, became clear about why we were there, about why, not just that they were coming to a medical clinic and getting free service, they weren't being interrogated about who they were, what job they had, etc., but they were just in need. They not only were served, but they also learned to understand why there was a difference in coming to that clinic and going to the county clinic. And this is why it is very important that we do not take lightly the role in these marches and having the establishment define our actions just because we are there. So if we're going to be there, let us be clear. But more than that, make sure that we're clear for the masses to politicize them, so that we do not join the misleadership class by misleading the people.
I'm Ezekiel Dixon Roman. I have a lot to say but I'm going to try to narrow it down to maybe one or two things. I'm the son of a former member of the Puerto Rican Student Union back in the 70s, a nephew to a young lord who passed away recently, and was also very much so trained in the ideologies and interests of the Cuban Revolution and the ideals of Fidel Castro. Grew up in a home that was very much so of a very romanticized kind of understanding of the Cuban Revolution and Fidel and others. I want to point to a couple of things that somewhat complicate sort of the conversation that we're having a bit. Connect Cuba to, and I should also add, I have been doing research in Cuba for several years as well. I sort of want to complicate a couple of things and add to some of the things that have been said by the panel, but also to some of the things that have been said by others. The year 1994 was raised when Fidel had came to the Bronx. I remember that very clearly. Grew up in Poughkeepsie, New York, so it was not too far away. That very same year was also a really critical moment in Cuba. When the relationship with the Soviet Union had fallen, Cuba fell into, as many of us know, the special period, and really hard economic times that almost put the revolution into question. And outside of Cuba, many expected to see the revolution fall. And what we did see was the resilience of the revolution. And not just any sort of resilience, a focus on human development, where over 80% of the government's resources were still going to education and healthcare. Something we cannot even say in the US. When have we ever been able to say that, period? Much of our resources still go to Department of Defense, the military. In 1994, though, Cuba had to turn to tourism in order to save itself economically. Prior to this, who do you think were the faces? The managers, the ones that were at the front desk. Prior to, no, it was the Afro-Cubans. Once they opened the doors of tourism, once they introduced the USL at that point, and people were able to get access to gratuity, to tips, beyond what they were being provided by the government. It shifted really quickly. The faces became predominantly white Cubans. April 1st, 1959, literally 3 months into the revolution, Fidel came out and said, to be racist is contra la revolución. But still, we see ideologically and culturally the endurance of such practices. To leave this part out, to leave this part of that history of the revolution is a really critical point. Because what also emerges is marginalized youth of color engaging in discourses and cultural productions such as hip hop, as ways of engaging in open and critical and political expression. This history also leads us to an understanding that Fidel, the narrative that Fidel was a sovereign power that we get from the US is completely inaccurate. It's completely inaccurate. In 1999, and I'm jumping around right now, please forgive me, but in 1999, Harry Belafonte went to visit Fidel. He was supposed to have a 45-minute meeting with Fidel to convince him of the importance of hip-hop in this revolution. That meeting went on for over 12 hours. Fidel literally asked him to join me throughout the rest of the day. By the end of that day, now mind you, at that point, Fidel was not interested in hip-hop. In fact, it was completely being censored and marginalized, did not get any radio space or anything. And by the end of that day, Fidel was convinced that hip-hop was an essential part of this revolution and is important for even thinking about the revolution's work throughout Latin America. Here's the important point about this though. When Fidel came out and nationally announced the importance of hip hop in the revolution, do you think it got taken up on TV? Do you think it got radio space? No. Cuba, not too far off from the US, is made up of a bunch of bureaucratic institutions that are engaging in decision making on their own. In Cuba, what Cubans will tell you, if it doesn't get airspace on TV or on radio, it doesn't exist. I'm sorry? So I'm going this is based on my own,
Sit here and let you do that. The hip hop movement, Malcolm X movement, all the hip hop groups that come out of Cuba, long before the 90s. Well, no, I'm just saying.
You're missing my point. My point is that it doesn't, it's not that it doesn't exist. For most Cubans, it does not get the kind of attention that it actually should be receiving, that it should have received. Cuban hip hop literally became eclipsed in 2002 by reggaeton. No, I'm not from Cuba. Thank you, I appreciate it. Because I have been doing research in Cuba for several years on Cuban hip hop and reggaeton. So let me finish. My main point is not that Cuban hip hop doesn't matter. In fact, I would say that Cuban hip hop is extremely political and extremely critical. The problem is, did it ever receive that kind of popularity that it really had the potential for? Unfortunately, reggaeton, eclipsing reggaeton in Cuba is completely about partying, vacilando. I'm gonna stop on this. I'll say this because it's part of what I'm trying to say is literally we have to situate the revolution in a larger global discourse. You go to Old Havana, and what do you see? United Colors of Benetton. You see other national stores international stores such as this. To buy a t-shirt of United Colors of Benetton, $70.
But wait a minute, who does that business belong to? Who does that business belong to?
Who does, say that?
You're talking about any of the corporations that you mentioned, who do they belong to?
Not Cuba.
See, that's what I tell you, it's totally incorrect. Half of any enterprise in Cuba belongs to the Cuban government, belongs to the Cuban people. No hotels, no corporations are coming into Cuba and got 100 or close to 90, 30, 40, everything in Havana and Guantanamo. Half of all the international enterprises belong to the Cuban people.
So I think you're missing my point. It's not even about ownership. It's about, even as a worker, if I'm working there and I'm making $15, $20 a month, but I'm selling a product, that's $70 a month.
Healthcare is paid for.
The
house is paid for.
I'm not questioning that. I'm not questioning that.
The argument that ruling class uses, that Cubans are underpaid. And the point is that the Cubans have free medical care, that the Cubans have free house, that housing belongs to them.
That's not my point.
Okay, can you just wrap it up in the next 60 seconds, because we gotta move to the next.
My main point is that we need to take seriously how global neoliberal forces are even making its way and playing itself out within the Cuban society right now. Literally going all the way back to 1994, when tourism gets introduced into Cuba. It begins then. And so as we look to it as a model, there are some really serious aspects about education and healthcare and all. But there are some other dimensions and other forces that are at play that we need to take seriously as to how the Cuban Revolution becomes helpful and how the Cuban Revolution has its limits, has its shortcomings.
Thank you so much. Okay, so one last question. Come on, this is the last question.
Not right now.
I hope we're not going too far off topic, but it is about, the pressing political questions today, which I think, is a fitting tribute to Fidel. So, like Skip and many other people here, I think I also just got back from DC today, so I just wanted to share some reflections on what happened over the weekend. So, the group, I helped organize the Answer Coalition protest, which was on Inauguration Day, not today, it was yesterday, along the inauguration route. And so, in a way, I am sympathetic to the critique of the Women's March. I mean, because for the last several months, we were in basically like a struggle with those forces. We were in a tactical polemic with them. We think that it has to be on Inauguration Day when the eyes of the world is on the political situation. We think we have to struggle with the National Park Service and with the Secret Service to have the right to do it along the inaugural parade route because, we don't want to do something that's like 3 miles away from anything that's important like it was today. And they were able to march to the White House, but that's because we secured the permit for them. So, certainly I am sympathetic to that. And I agree that the leadership of those demonstrations are like Democratic Party, nonprofit types. Not all of the demonstrations that spontaneously happened after the election, but the Women's March certainly, I mean, if you look at the organizations that were part of it, the central leaders that were kind of elevated by the bourgeois media, certainly that's true. So I think that all of these things are really important to work through because we're in such a dramatically changed political situation. Whereas in the last 8 years, we're used to a small and numerically small, but highly ideologically coherent and radical opposition to the Obama administration among the left. Of course, there is also the right-wing opposition to the Obama administration. So now we're in a much bigger sea because the president is a Republican. And yeah, I mean, it's annoying that like all these liberals want to come out and protest the same policies because it's a Republican, but that's not really the question, right? Like I agree it's annoying, but like what do we do about it? So, Ania brought up the question of the United Front, and there's lots of different types of United Fronts. There's a United Front from above, there could be a United Front from below. So I certainly don't agree with the United Front from above, like we have a meeting with the leaders of the Democratic Party nonprofits and NGOs, and we come up with a common action plan. Certainly that won't lead us anywhere. But I mean, our group that organized the January 20th demonstration, like we also went to the Women's March. And we did outreach, we tried to talk to people, we tried to build unity with the people who attended there because, there's such a tremendous number of people. I mean, there are probably like 2 million people in the streets today across the United States. And even if we make the assessment that 95% of those people are completely useless, and which, I mean, I think is too harsh, but maybe that's true. Even if we make the assessment that 95% of them are totally bought off by Hillary Clinton, the Democratic Party line, and make no doubt about it, there are plenty of Hillary Clinton supporters there, that's still like 100,000 people who are looking for some type of radical alternative and just going there because that's what all the newspapers are writing about, right? Certainly I don't have any illusions. We're like the left wing in the anti-Trump movement is a minority current. I mean, that's definitely one of the conclusions that I reached from this weekend's activities. But to bring it back to the Cuban Revolution, I mean, like a radical left-wing minority doesn't always remain the minority current. I mean, when the Cuban Revolution happened, it was not a socialist revolution. Fidel declared the socialist character of the revolution in April 1961 because of the living contradictions that they had to deal with, the assaults from imperialism, the internal assaults from the domestic bourgeoisie. And so I think that as people come into contact with the reality of politics in this country, their consciousness can change very fast. And the question is where are the revolutionaries going to be when their consciousness is changing and they're looking for answers to the question.